Hello, I'm Rob B with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. This week, we bring you up to speed with what is happening in the market, what's happening with the election, what it means to you as a property investor, and then we start to share our beliefs on politics. It's a juicy episode.
Yes, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. In case you don't know, we buy over £100 million worth of property every year for our clients. You can find out more about that at propertyhub.net/invest. But today we are bringing you our monthly market update. Delayed by a week this month because we wanted to wait for the parties' manifestos to be published so we can tell you everything that the main parties and beyond have to say about housing in their election manifestos. But that's not the only thing going on this month, believe it or not. We've also got a build-to-rent mini special and some fascinating rental statistics as well. But first, Rob, I think we should at least touch on house prices.
We should, although if you want our full opinion and analysis of house prices, we've covered this in some detail on the last couple of podcasts in our news segment there. But the headline is house prices are up. Well, it depends actually on which report you look at, but the most notable eye-catching report is from Nationwide, and the latest house prices reported there show that they have gone up by 0.4% in the last month. Now, this comes after 2 months of mild but slightly surprising falls because the market sentiment seems strong at the moment. Not wild, not aggressive, but just maybe a quiet confidence, you could call it, in the market right now. So a couple of months of falls was a surprise from Nationwide, but that's been corrected now, and we've seen strong growth in the last month of 0.4. It's flat, according to Zoopla, and Halifax, as we've reported, it's down by 0.1%, which is pretty much flat as well. So we're starting to get a picture of how this year's looking, and it's very modest growth, I think is how you could describe it, which is good because all the experts told us we were going to see falls this year. So modest, steady growth over the first 5 months of the year is welcome. But Rob, let's get on to stuff we haven't covered, and there's some really interesting data and news on the rents this month.
Yes, there is. HomeTrack's monthly rental report always makes for interesting reading. And we've recently started to see a discrepancy between the headline numbers and the story it tells if you dig a little deeper. So the headline annual rental inflation number is 6.6%, which is obviously lower than the sort of around 10% that we've had over recent years, but still high, still far above inflation. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the quarterly breakdown, a lot of that comes from last year. It's still a hangover from when we did have high rental inflation that was caused by extreme demand and a reduction in supply. If you take the last quarterly figure and annualize it, so you're basically saying, what's happening now? Let's imagine that's what's going to happen for the next year. There's really very little rental inflation at all. The rate is far, far lower. And that's because the market is coming back into alignment. So rental demand is still far higher than it was pre-pandemic, but 25% lower than it was last year. Same when you look at the stock of homes for rent, lower than it was pre-pandemic, but up on last year. So you're seeing slowdowns across the board, especially if you look at the last 3 months. If you take that last 3 month figure, one region is negative, and that region is London. Rents falling in London. And I've got to say, Rob, that does match what I'm seeing in the areas of London that I monitor. Lots of stock going onto the market, sticking there and having multiple reductions. So it seems like London, at least, has found its ceiling. And rental growth across the country is coming back towards a more normal, a more typical level of growth. But that's not to say, Rob, that the rental market is quiet, as a couple of other stories show.
I think the London market is really interesting, Rob, because you and I have both been watching London for a number of years now, and not just because we both live in or near London, but because it's always going to be an interesting place to invest. We've talked about it on the podcast so many times over the years, about how over the long term, London is a really strong investment case. But currently, there clearly are better areas to invest in. But at some point, London will become a good area to invest in. And it was starting to get to a point where you thought, maybe in the next couple of years, it's time for London, because rents were rising. But as we've also reported on a regular basis on this podcast, prices are falling, maybe just slightly, but especially when you account for inflation, they really are falling in real terms. So rents going up and prices coming down meant that yields were starting to improve, and it becomes an interesting opportunity again. It didn't look as overpriced as it did, say, 2 years ago. But still, compared to other areas, not where it needed to be to get us involved and get us excited. But it was going in the right direction. If this is the trend now, it may be longer before we look at London again. If rents are going to start falling, then it means that London becomes less attractive. Obvious, right? The thing is, rents aren't collapsing in London if you look at the data. Over the last quarter, according to Supla, it's down by 0.3%. But when other areas are seeing strong growth, that is quite significant. So London continues to be a fascinating area to watch for investment. Still not right. Still too early for us to go in at least. But if you do invest in London, this dynamic of rents and falling house prices is really interesting. What is really fascinating, though, in the rental market is the appetite for build-to-rent and the institutions that invest in build-to-rent. There's been a real shift in sentiment here as well. At the end of last year, the build-to-rent market slowed down completely. There was not many deals going on. There was a little bit of nervousness. But it seems, just as we've reported on this podcast, those green shoots of optimism that are in the property market right now are absolutely there with build to rent, and they're starting to make moves again. Blackstone have just agreed to buy 1,750 homes from the builder Vistry, and this is quite a bold move considering that I'd say general landlord consensus is probably slightly negative right now. I know we're not on a podcast and we're quite optimistic about the market, and you might be listening because you take all the data that we give you, but generally I'd say the sentiment for landlords may be slightly negative, but it's not stopping build to rent. And that's where the smart, unemotional money is. And it's really interesting to see these moves. And this smart money, Rob, doesn't want you following, because there's an article in City AM where the top executive at Legal & General hasn't been too kind to landlords. And it seems that he doesn't want us general landlords involved in this game.
No, that's because we're unscrupulous, apparently. He says you've got owners of rental property who are not managing them well. Unscrupulous landlords who are taking people's deposits and giving them a bad experience. We're here to reset standards of quality that renters should expect. That's what the global head of real assets at L&G is quoted as saying. And in general, I think that's obviously pretty unfair, very broad brush, but there is a point in there somewhere, which is that when you've got 1 million individual owners, the standards are going to be very variable. In there, you have got unscrupulous landlords. Most are not, but some are. But when he talks about institutional operators resetting the standards of quality that renters should expect, I think that is true. And we've spoken about that on the show before, haven't we? There'll be plenty of people who are operating at that level already, but there will be a chunk of individual landlords who will have to raise their game to match those standards or get out completely. And on the whole, you've got to see that as a good thing, because for a start, it's only right that people should have homes that they're happy with and a good value and are well managed. But it also means, coming onto politics, the sector is going to be less under the microscope. There's going to be less need for regulation if market forces, if competition in itself is forcing standards to be raised where they need to be.
It's time to move on to the juicy bit, the bit that you may have been waiting for, although the stuff that we have covered is really interesting and it is really important. But we don't have these election thingamajigs that often, and people want to know. Lots of questions, Rob, into us through our different platforms around the election, around a potential Labour government coming in, what that means for property. We've talked about it a bit on the podcast already, but we now have the manifestos. So we had an indication of their policies previously, but we've waited to report on the manifestos. And I think we can rattle through the manifestos part quite quickly, Rob, but it's the stuff I want to talk about after, which I think is more interesting, because the manifestos, I feel maybe it's just because we talked about it already, but certainly from the two main political parties, there's nothing new, there's nothing radical here. Build a lot of houses, which is pretty much what everyone says. And both Labour and Conservatives are both saying that they will get rid of no-fault evictions. It nearly happened anyway, but they will see that through, whichever one gets in. Beyond that, Rob, and we will talk about some of the other parties in a minute because I think there's some interesting things there. But from the big two, and let's face it, it looks like, according to all the opinion polls at the moment, that Labour are going to win. So maybe we should focus on that. Is there anything that's caught your eye, anything that worries you, or dare I say, anything that excites you?
Excites? No, I think it's all very much as you would expect, really. Both of the main parties are continuing, like you said, with abolishing no-fault evictions. The Labour manifesto specifically says that it would do it immediately. which of course I can't do it actually immediately, but it does strongly imply that they're going to be getting a move on with it. I imagine that the quickest way for them to get a move on with it would be to resurrect something very similar to the Renters Reform Bill that we had before and then just push it through. But they don't specifically talk about all the other things that were in that bill, so they could just do a standalone piece of legislation saying no more Section 21, and that would be it. I can't imagine that's the case, but it's possible. The main thing is that they're saying that they would do it immediately. The Conservatives have just said that they'd do it. They haven't said when. The other main thing of interest, I would say, is probably around leasehold, because we know that the leasehold reform bill went through in the dying hours of the last parliament, and sort of various things in there which are good news for leaseholders. One thing that didn't make it in there was a cap on existing ground rents. The Conservatives have said that they would cap ground rents at £250 and reduce it to peppercorn rates over time. So that's something they were intending to do anyway, but in the end couldn't make it happen in time. So they're sticking with that one. The Labour Party is going further with that and saying that they would bring the feudal leasehold system to an end, banning new leasehold flats and addressing unfair ground rents. And just to be clear, that's not going to mean that there are no more flats. It's not going to mean that the flats will all be freehold, because that wouldn't make any sense. I think it means, from things I've said before, that they'll do everything under a system called common hold, which already exists but isn't really used. But although there are some differences there, Rob, as I've just outlined, based on what it says in the manifestos at least, I can't find too many major areas of difference there. Something that landlords might have feared to see in a Labour manifesto was something around rent controls, but that does not get a mention.
You are absolutely right, Rob. We've said as much on the podcast over the last few weeks that whoever wins, and it looks like it's a Labour win at the moment, according to the opinion polls, that's not an endorsement. You'll hear more about my beliefs in Hub Extra. But if we accept that Labour look like they're going on to win this election, will that mean big changes for us as property investors and landlords? No. Will there be changes? Yes, but they were pretty much going to be brought in by the Conservatives anyway. There's not anything radical here. But actually, I welcome that it's not that radical. I'd prefer improvements, but the way the trend has gone over the last few years, it's gone against us as property investors. So I do like the fact that it's not seeming to get any worse. That's not a promise, everyone. That's just me assessing the manifestos. But this has also been backed up by a survey in Rightmove, where they surveyed people to understand what they believe would happen on their plans to move after an election. And 95% of people surveyed said it wouldn't affect their plans to move, so transact in property. Now, that's the owner-occupiers market, but that is the biggest part of the market. So the property market as a whole is driven by that area, of course, like it should be. And it's positive to see that 95% of people aren't changing their plans. So they aren't spooked or scared either. But what about the other parties? There are other parties involved. We've not talked about it on the podcast much, but I think we should. And again, I'll touch up on this a little bit more in the Hub Extra section. But we do have other parties and we do have other commitments. So the Lib Dems, if we look at what the Lib Dems are promising, and this could be a good or a bad thing depending on your point of view, it's not that different. The Lib Dems have committed to building the most houses, so that's nice. And they've also talked about garden cities. Long-time listeners will remember how George Osborne was going to build us lots of garden cities up and down the nation. That didn't happen. The Lib Dems have resurfaced that one, so that's nice. So garden cities, 10 of them apparently are going to be built. The maybe only point of difference is that 3-year tenancies will be standard if they get into power. But honestly, if you go through the manifesto, and there is more there, it is just very much more of the same, just worded in a different way. So is there anybody else with a different point of view? Let's look at the Green Party. They are open to rent controls. So they are not saying that they will bring in rental controls, but they will give local authorities the power to control rents if the rental market is unaffordable for local people. So giving power to local authorities. And then we have Reform, Rob, and it actually does seem that there is a point of difference with their policies compared to some of the other parties.
Yeah, again, not an endorsement, but if you are a landlord and if you are voting solely within your own interests and solely within your own housing interests, you'd be voting for Reform, because they would abolish the Renters Reform Bill and scrap the 2019 tax changes for landlords. So all this stuff about not being able to claim your mortgage interest as an expense, they would do away with that. So again, purely when it comes to housing and purely when it comes to what's actually in the manifestos, what these parties do is another thing entirely. But there's a genuine point of difference with Reform, There is a genuine point of difference with the Green Party in completely the opposite direction, because they're saying that they would allow rent controls at a local level. And everyone else, yeah, there are differences, but it's all pretty much different flavours of the same thing.
Now it's time for Hub Extra. And let's do something dangerous. Let's talk about politics. And give opinions on politics. Because what we've done in this episode is given you the news. But I think it's really, really interesting, this vote. Personally, I still haven't decided on who to vote for. I'm getting closer. But one of the reasons why I'm getting closer is the resource that I'm about to share with you this week, which is a website that helps you find out which parties align with your beliefs. So it'll ask you a load of questions, and then based on your answers, it will give you a percentage score to which parties you're most aligned with. So that website, and it'll be in the show notes because it's a bit of a long URL, is uk.isidewith.com. That's uk.isidewith.com. The link will be in the show notes to make life easy for you. If you are, like me, undecided, this could be a really interesting tool, because I know a lot of people who are disillusioned with this vote because they just don't know who to vote for. None of the big two are really appealing to them. Now, if they do appeal to you, this is not to tell you not to vote for them. This is just me sharing my experiences. But I think you've got to be careful if what I'm saying is winding you up or getting you emotional. Because as we've said on the podcast many times before, you shouldn't get emotional over politics, because pretty much whoever gets in, without exception, you'll be fine. It's down to you whether you'll be a success or not. You're more important in influencing your life than any other political party. And something else I see in politics as well, and I think it's getting less, but again, I want to say it in case you are finding yourself in this situation so you can catch yourself, is your political team is not your football team. So you don't have to stick by a party if they've changed just because you voted for them time and time before. I think I pretty much voted for all the major parties over the years, because each and every time I'll look at the manifestos and I'll make a decision on which party aligns with me in terms of their beliefs and what they want to do, but also their values. And the values of a party are really important as well. So if you are finding that you're partisan with politics, maybe take a view that it doesn't matter which colour of rosette that you vote for. What matters is what they want to deliver. So I encourage you, maybe even if you've decided on who you're voting for, to take this quiz to help you better develop your understanding of what is being offered out there, because your vote is important. And I've gone full circle on this because I've been frustrated because I live in an area where one of two parties is going to win. And previously, it's been even worse, where there was just a landslide delivered for a certain party each and every year, which was fine if I wanted to vote for them at the time, but frustrating when not. But I think there are parties out there beyond the main parties that are interesting. This is not an endorsement, because I'm going to talk about two parties that are very, very different, and we've touched on them already. But you've got parties like the Green Party and the Reform Party that are being more radical with their economic views. And I'm talking about economics here, so I'm branching out from property and just looking at the economy as a whole. But there's more on offer there. There's more radical views there. And if you are interested in voting for parties like the Lib Dems or like Reform or like the Green Party or others, but you think, but they're not going to win, I think you should change your mind, because I think you can make a statement on the popular vote. And I think that is important. So I've gone full circle, as I've said already on this. I was frustrated, even last week frustrated, that I felt my vote might not make a difference. But actually, I think all of us can make a statement. It doesn't matter who you vote for. It doesn't matter if they don't win. But if you make a statement and that party delivers a lot of popular votes, then you are making a difference. Our political voting system, I think, is frustrating because it's really a two-party race. But if enough people vote for who they truly believe in, I do think that we can start to make a difference. Maybe I'm an optimist. I am an optimist. But I do think you should make a difference, even if your party can't win, and start with that website to help you decide who you most align with. Rob, how was my pitch?
You are an optimist, Rob, but I completely agree. And I think that message is very helpful in helping people to feel more engaged. Because, for example, the constituency that I live in, it makes zero difference what I personally do because the result is always going to be the same. And in the majority of the country, people live in areas like that. So it can make you feel disengaged. But what you say about the popular vote, I think, is completely right. And if you end up this time round with, yes, a pretty much guaranteed result, but both main parties losing share to a collection of other options, then you would think that over time that might encourage them to change their positions, to consider other ideas or to diverge from each other. Who knows if that will actually be the case, but I like that way of looking at it. And I think doing the quiz is something that I'm going to do and is something that everyone should do. Because above all, I do think it's the tribalism that is damaging. We're lucky not to have it to the same extent that they do in the US, but it is damaging. So I think being forced to look at the policies with the colours taken off them is a really valuable exercise.
Well, hopefully we've not lost your vote and you will return in your numbers for the podcast next week. And of course, we will be in the Sunday Times answering your question on Sunday and delivering answers to your questions in Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So until all those wonderful events occur, take care, have fun, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.